Wanted to share this essay I put together with the chat. It's basically a combination of different books I've read over the couple of years or so. Had a copy and pasted myself because the AI kept changing stuff and all that, kept revising stuff. So spent like several hours trying to, I think like a whole day, I guess. But hopefully it's it should be accurate. But I'll list the sources at the bottom, and this time I tried to incorporate them into incorporate them more into the paragraphs and stuff, the sections. And I was at about 20 sections. It dropped down to like 14. There was just so much stuff. But anyway, it's basically about system, right? Ideological systems, and it's basically a critique into that area. And so that's really what it's about. It's not really about critiquing specifically people, but it's just a system that the system like the people operate under. So if that makes sense, like the ideology or so, political ideology or whatever. So anyway, it's called God's Republic: The American Covenant versus Byzantine Monarchy. Now I'm looking at it from like the Republic of America. I'm looking at it from its religious variable, right? American religion. Because to me, American religion is not generic religion. It is distinctly Christian. It's biblical religion. It's tied into covenant thinking and biblical principles and the law and stuff. And so it comes with basically like its own culture and people and its own God, right? Their own God. So that's how I'm framing it under the dissenting consciousness and the Lockean Christianity, right? So that's what I'm looking at it as. I see the American mind and the American soul as religious, but not just religious generally speaking, but biblical, right? Like a biblical consciousness, or Christian religion, biblical religion, basically. So that's, to me, it's like what reflects the mind, the American mind and the American soul, basically. In that sense, religion. So it's not just pluralistic or, generic. So anyway, God's Republic, the American Covenant versus Byzantine Monarchy. First section is God alone is King, the biblical foundation. From Genesis to Revelation, Scripture proclaims a transcendent truth that no mortal crown can eclipse. Only God is King. His sovereignty is eternal, unassailable, and independent of human ambition. The earthly throne is fleeting. His is everlasting. For the Lord is our judge, the Lord is our lawgiver, the Lord is our King, He will save us. Isaiah 33:22. Here lies the essence of divine governance. Law, justice, and kingship converge in the Creator. Unlike pagan empires that deify men, the Bible establishes divine transcendence and moral authority as the cornerstone of societal order. When Moses ascended in Sinai, he did not receive kingship. Rather, God enthroned himself in the law, establishing covenantal governance. Deuteronomy 17 underscores this principle, and human king must bow to divine law, never supplant it. It says, "You shall surely set a king over you, but he shall not multiply horses for himself, and it shall be with him, and he shall read in it all the days of his life." 3 Deuteronomy 17:14-19. Monarchy, therefore, is permitted, not ordained. Israel's covenantal polity prefigured constitutionalism, governance under God's law, not human whim. Even Judges 21:25, every man did what was right in his own eyes, does not celebrate chaos, but illuminates the moral responsibility of self-governance under God's watchful sovereignty. Livini, the biblical roots of American constitutionalism. The heart of governance is covenant, not crown. The law reigns because God reigns. Attempts to replace his kingship with man's only yields disorder, corruption, and idolatry. 2. The Mosaic model versus monarchical idolatry. The second account, 2. The Mosaic model versus monarchical idolatry. The biblical account of Israel's demand for a king for Samuel 8 is one of the most powerful condemnations of monarchy in world literature. When Israel cries, "Give us a king to judge us like the nations," the Lord replies, "They have not rejected you, but they have rejected me, that I should not reign over them." Monarchy here is divine concession to human rebellion, not divine will. Samuel warns that kings will conscript sons, seize fields, and enslave the people. History proved his prophecy true. The Deuteronomist critique of dynastic succession, as David T. Lamb demonstrates in Righteous Jehu and His Evil Heirs, consistently portrays kingship as a deviation from covenantal faithfulness. Each monarch's failure underscores the futility of earthly sovereignty apart from divine law. Regardless of the form of governance God provided, judges, elders, or kings, God alone is sovereign. Even when Israel received a human king, the ultimate authority remained divine. This highlights the impossibility of a divine right monarchy without corruption and theocratic idolatry. 3. The Declaration as Covenant and Oath. The American Declaration of Independence stands not merely as a political manifesto, but as a covenantal oath, a sacred declaration of a people entering into moral and spiritual compact under the one God of Scripture. The founder's language says, with a firm reliance on the protection of divine providence, echoes the Hebraic pattern of covenantal appeals invoking the same divine sovereignty that bounds Israel to its covenant with God. This is a conscious theological act, as shown in Proclaim Liberty Throughout the Land, Solovik, where the founders appeals to divine justice, creation, and providence are traced to the Hebrew Bible, the Hebrew Bible's moral order. John Adams testified that he and Jefferson shared the general principles of Christianity and the general principles of English and American liberty, which he deemed as eternal and immutable as the existence and attributes of God. This shared creed reveals the moral foundation of the Declaration. Its authors were men of covenantal conscience, rooted in biblical deism, convinced of divine order and reliant upon divine providence. The Declaration mirrors the biblical covenant formula: preamble, historical prologue, stipulations, witness, and oath. As Daniel J. Elazar, The Covenant Connection, shows, this represents a political theology consciously derived from federal Fodes theology, the Reformed understanding of covenant as both divine and civil obligation. America's founding reenacts Sena's moral grammar, transposed from ecclesial covenant to political one, binding citizens under divine law. Hence, the Declaration is not a rebellion against God, but a renewal of covenant under God, a return to first principles. Government exists by consent because authority itself is derivative of divine justice. The American covenant is both a spiritual and civic act, a people's oath to live under divine sovereignty, with no human monarch mediating God's rule. Lockean Christianity and dissenting conscience. John Locke's political theology, described by Yechiel Eider as a Hebraic vision of liberty, provided the bridge between Reformation covenantal theology and the American founding. Locke's The Reasonableness of Christianity and letter concerning toleration reject ecclesiastical coercion and divine right monarchy, grounding human liberty in the moral law of the Creator, revealed to conscience. His debt to the Hebrew Bible is profound. Locke's covenantal obligations mirror the biblical teaching that every soul stands accountable before God. This dissenting moral vision shaped the religious imagination of colonial America. Nicholas P. Miller, The Religious Roots of the First Amendment, demonstrates that dissenting Protestant conscience, especially among Baptist, Quakers, and Reformed thinkers, transforms Locke's theology into an American civil principle. Liberty of conscience is a sacred duty. freedom is obedience to God rather than to man, not a license to rule others. Jefferson's creator and Adams's acknowledgement of divine providence represents the political language equivalent of Locke's Christian deism. As Aaron Shalev, American Zion, notes, early America identified itself as a new Israel, a covenantal nation under divine calling, its revolution a moral act before God. The founders presupposed a biblical God whose law undergirded both conscience and civil society. Their liberalism, their moral reasoning, and their civil structures are rooted in the same divine framework. Thus, the American foundings represents the triumph of Lockean Christianity, a faith of free conscience and covenantal responsibility over papal and imperial theocracies. Locke dissolves divine monarchy, affirming that God alone is king, and every just polity mirrors divine justice only when grounded in moral liberty. The American covenant recovers the religion of liberty, the faith of the prophets renewed in civic governance under reason, illuminated by revelation. Christ's kingdom and the end of empire. When Christ appeared, he declared that his kingdom was not of this world. John 18:36. The Gospels never record Jesus legitimating Caesar's divinity or authority of any empire beyond pragmatic submission, rendered unto Caesar. Was no blessing of imperial rule. It was a subtle dethroning of worldly authority in favor of divine kingship. Early Christians understood this profoundly. Their confession, Jesus is Lord, was treason against the imperial creed. Caesar is Lord. They suffered persecution not over taxes or politics, but for defying the theological claim of imperial idolatry. Their martyrdoms, and as recorded by Eusebius and chronicled in early Christian texts, highlight the refusal to conflate civic obedience with worship, a principle foundational to dissenting Christian thought. The New Testament Church, in its dissenting stance, refused to mirror the coercive ethos of imperial religion, as Howard Brooke, Come Out of My People, emphasizes. The early church's ethic was covenantal and voluntary, anchored in conscience under God rather than enforced by the state power. Its governance model rejected the syncretic fusion of throne and altar, what later Byzantine Christianity claimed as symphonia, revealing that divine favor and civil authority are not coextensive. Christ's kingdom thus reframes authority. Lasting political institutions do not equate to divine blessing. The empire may endure it, yet its power can be morally hollow. Conversely, a covenantal republic like America, guided by conscience under God, may flourish spiritually and morally even amidst temporal instability. The corruption of imperial Christianity. We're on number 6. The Constantinian shift, the union of throne and altar, was not a triumph of the faith, but its political captivity. By marrying the church to the empire, Christianity was transformed from a covenantal faith of conscience into an instrument of coercion and hierarchy. What began as the kingdom of conscience became the empire of force. Byzantine emperors repeatedly wielded religious authority to legitimize political power, often engaging in purges, theological coercion, or iconoclasm to consolidate their rule. So this Griffin, the liturgical past of Byzantium and early Rus, and Caldelis, the Byzantine Republic, document instances where emperors controlled ecclesiastical offices to maintain secular dominance, proving the ideal of symphonia or perfect unity of a church and state was largely illusory. R. Winthrop and co-authors in The Political Economy of Theocracy demonstrates that the concentration of religious and political authority fosters corruption and instability. Byzantine monarchy illustrates this vividly. Claims of divine ordination legitimized elite self-interest rather than actual moral governance. Violence, intrigue, and dynastic turmoil were endemic, revealing the fatal flaws of force-based theocratic rule. In contrast, the American covenantal system intentionally separates powers and limits coercion, where Byzantine Christianity made hierarchy and violence a feature. America frames religious liberty and conscience as virtues, a flaw corrected by institutional design and moral self-governance. Sorry if it worded it weirdly. Divine favor here is instructive longevity, and empire do not signal blessings, while moral alignment with God's covenant, as in the American dissenting model, produces enduring stability with unethical governance. Yeah, so basically the coercion and religious coercion into dogmatic orthodoxy is I guess became a feature of the Byzantine system, basically, and the American system is seen as a flaw. Because I do go over the religious violence in early America, and how it basically progressed from that into religious liberty. Yeah, sorry, trying to speak clearly. Yeah, number 7. The religious violence of empire. Byzantine and post-Byzantine imperial systems repeatedly sanctified violence as a tool of religious and political authority. The Nika Revolt of 532 AD, which claimed over 30,000 lives in Constantinople alone, exemplifies the lethal fusion of church and state. Imperial theology framed such bloodshed as divine will, justifying mass killings and persecution to preserve doctrinal and dynastic order, from Griffin, the liturgical past, and in Byzantium and early Rus. Religious purges, iconoclastic campaigns, and wars against heretics were not incidental but systematic features of imperial governance. Each act of violence reinforced the illusion of symphonia, unity between church and state. Yet historical reality proves otherwise. Church leaders were frequently co-opted, exiled or executed. Emperors were overthrown despite their claims of divine favor, demonstrating the instability of force-based theocracy. Caldillus, the Byzantine Republic. In stark contrast, America's dissenting Christian founders sought refuge from precisely this type of religious violence. The Puritans, Baptists, and Quakers fled course of hierarchies to establish governance under conscience and covenant. The Republic emerged not from conquest and coercion, but from deliberation, moral accountability, and obedience to God's law. The early American experience proves that a system grounded in conscience rather than imperial fiat corrects its errors without resorting to violence, a feature of divine favor manifesting in stability and longevity. When Byzantine Christianity made violent enforcement a feature, America treated coercion as a flaw, corrected through law and civic virtue. Divine favor is thus measured not by power or longevity, but by the moral health of society under God's covenant. 8. America's founding, the covenant of Christian descent. Unlike Byzantine Imperium, America's founding emerges from the moral and religious descent of Christians who refused to submit to state-imposed orthodoxy. John Locke's vision of liberty of conscience, filtered through the Reformed Protestant thought, became the philosophical and theological foundation of the Republic. As Nicholas P. Miller, The Religious Roots of the First Amendment, demonstrates, dissenting Protestants, Baptists, Quakers, and Reformed communities infused early America with a framework where conscience, not coercion, dictated faith and civic engagement. The Declaration of Independence codifies this descent into covenantal principle. Its text invokes the same God of the Hebrew Bible as the moral source of authority, asserting that legitimate government derives from consent under divine law. The American founders did not reject religion. They rejected the claim of emperors or kings to mediate God's will. Their system reframes biblical governance. Human authority reframes biblical governance. Human authority is subordinate to divine law, and obedience to God ensures freedom, justice, and moral accountability. This covenantal framework allowed the Republic to self-correct. Early conflicts such as disputes over state-sponsored religion in Massachusetts were resolved through deliberation, law, and accommodation rather than violence, where Byzantine Christianity conflated enforcement with virtue. America's dissenting covenant treated coercion as a flaw, corrected through institutional structures grounded in biblical conscience. The genius of America's founding lies in the synthesis: covenantal fidelity to God, protection of conscience, and lawful self-governance. Divine favor here is realized, not in the grandeur of imperial throne or the suppression of dissent, but in enduring liberty, moral stability, and a system capable of reforming its errors without bloodshed. And this is number 9. America's constitutional covenant and divine order. America's Constitution embodies Isaiah's triad: judge, lawgiver, king. Refrain for a covenantal republic. No single human office holder concentrates these powers. Instead, the separation of powers reflects the divine order, ensuring that law and conscience, not arbitrary authority, govern the nation. John Adams famously observed that our Constitution was made for a moral and religious people. It is wholly inadequate to any government, to the government of any other. Here Adams admits or highlights that the republic's longevity and stability are rooted not in political machinery alone, but in the biblically informed conscience of its citizens. Thomas Jefferson's Creator God invoked in the Declaration is the same God acknowledged by the Reformed conscience, the God of law, justice, and covenantal morality. This confirms that American liberty is not secular liberty, but liberty grounded in divine moral law. The Constitution's structural genius enshrines covenantal fidelity. Laws are instruments of God's justice. Offices are subordinate to conscience, and the people's allegiance is ultimately to the Creator. Unlike Byzantine imperial Christianity, which fused coercion with religious authority to create cycles of violence, the American system channels obedience to God into lawful, deliberative governance. Though the amendments, judicial review, and democratic practice, the Constitutional Covenant ensures institutional self-correction. Disputes over rights, religion, or authority are mediated through the rule of law, preserving both liberty and divine moral order. Divine favor in this context is evidenced not by conquest or oppression, not by centuries of stable governance, peaceful transfers of power, and the capacity for moral and legal reform. So if I read that correctly, yeah, but by centuries of stable governance, peaceful transfers of power, and the capacity for moral and legal reform. Okay. This is number 10. Self-correcting republic versus self-destructive empire. The contrast between America and Byzantine Christendom is stark. Byzantine imperial theology depended on coercion to maintain order, produced an endless cycle of revolts, palace conspiracies, and dynastic bloodshed between 330 and 1453 AD. Byzantium experienced over 1,000 rebellions, usurpations, and coups, averaging nearly one every 1.5 years or so. Religious legitimacy was wielded as propaganda, masking the self-interest of rulers rather than reflecting divine justice. The so-called symphonia, harmony of church and state, was more illusion than reality, as repeated conflicts between emperors and patriarchs proved. In contrast, America's covenantal constitutional republic is self-correcting. From the Revolutionary War to the era to the Civil War and beyond, the nation has endured crisis without succumbing to coups or imperial seizure. Over 240 years, the peaceful transfer of powers has become a hallmark of governance. Stability demonstrates the divine favor is not guaranteed by duration or might, but by alignment with God's moral order and covenantal obedience. For Byzantine emperors, legitimized dynastic and coercive authority as sacred. American liberty relies on conscience, law, and institutional checks. Missteps such as early American religious violence or sectarian disputes were addressed through legal and moral correction, reflecting a covenantal ethos. The Reformed conscience invoked in both founding documents and civil discourse, channels obedience to God and to lawful reform, ensuring moral accountability at every level. Thus, the self-correcting republic is not only more just, but more enduring. Stability flows from obedience to divine law, whereas coercion breeds cycles of destruction. America's model proves that a nation under God's covenant can maintain liberty and order without succumbing to the fatal flaws inherent in imperial theocracy. Section 11, religious freedom versus religious violence. Byzantine Christendom and its post-Byzantine successors exemplify the dangers of combining religious and political authority between the 4th and 15th centuries. And countless Christians were executed, exiled, or persecuted for heresy or dissent. The Nika Revolt of 532 AD, which claimed over 30,000, illustrates how imperial theology sanctified violence in the service of power. Later iconoclastic disputes and Coptic persecutions reinforced that in the empire, religious coercion was not in operation. It was a structural feature. In sharp contrast, America's founding dissenters, Puritan Baptists, Quakers, and Reformed Protestants, established a system grounded in conscience rather than coercion. The First Amendment enshrining freedom of religion does not reject God, it rejects Caesar's claim to divinity. This legal framework reflects a covenantal ethic, where moral obligation to God guides civic obedience rather than the sword. America also demonstrates a self-correcting nature in religious practice. Early struggles with sectarian violence, such as disputes over congregationalist authority over post-revolutionary religious conflicts, or post-revolutionary religious conflicts, were addressed through legal and institutional reform, confirming that liberty under God's law is self-reforming rather than coercive. As Sackman Berkovich notes in the American Jeremiad, this prophetic tradition transforms moral failure into moral renewal, turning crisis into a reaffirming of covenantal principle. The ideological contrast is clear. Byzantine rulers equated temporal authority with divine sanction, institutionalizing violence as a tool of governance. America, by contrast, recognizes that longevity of a system does not equate to divine blessing. Moral legitimacy arises from obedience to God's law, accountability through conscience, and institutional mechanisms of reform. Where imperial Christianity made coercion and violence a feature, America treats moral failure as a flaw to be corrected, embodying the covenantal promise that liberty and justice endure under a guiding divine guidance. Sorry, my neighbor's outside playing music. He's playing Star Wars, I think it's Darth Vader's team, I don't remember. But anyway, this is section 12. The failure of divine monarchy. History has rendered its verdict upon those who claim to rule by divine right. Their thrones have crumbled beneath the weight of their own pretensions. From the Caesars of Rome to the Caesars of Russia, the divine monarchies of the old world mask human ambition in the sacred language, forging idols of power and calling them holy. Byzantium is often portrayed as the golden image of a Christian empire, the model of symphonia between church and state, yet history exposes this notion as an illusion. The so-called symphonia was never harmony between equals, but an endless negotiation of dominance. The emperor, crowned by the patriarch, claimed to be the protector of orthodoxy, yet wielded coercive power to dictate theology, exile dissenters, and command conscience. Here the myth of divine monarchy meets its collapse. As historian Anthony Caldelis demonstrates in the Byzantine Republic, People in Power, and New Rome, the Byzantine system was not a truly divine monarchy at all, but a political fiction. Beneath the facade of imperial divinity, Byzantium functioned as a disguised republic, its emperors deriving legitimacy not from divine ordination, but from popular acclamation and political necessity. In truth, Caldelis writes, Byzantium was not a theocracy, but a polity that required consent, a republic in imperial costume. This means that even in the most iconic Christian empire, divine monarchy was never reality, only rhetoric. The Byzantine emperor was a man, not a god. his authority fragile and negotiated. When emperors lost favor or failed militarily, they were overthrown, blinded, or exiled. The sacred crown proving as mortal as the man who wore it. The supposed divine kingship of Byzantium was therefore an illusion of theology masking the republic beneath. Divine monarchy was not sustained by divine blessing, but by the sword, and thus it decayed by the sword. Its long duration did not mark divine favor, but divine forbearance. Its splendor concealed a slow moral and political decay. America, by contrast, did not enthrone men, but law. It consecrated liberty, not power. Its covenantal order did not call rulers gods, but servants of God. The republic survived because it submitted to the one true sovereign, the Creator acknowledged in the Declaration. The Lord reigned, let the earth rejoice. Psalm 97:1. The Christian republic endures not because of imperial force, but because of moral truth. Where the Byzantine symphonia claimed harmony and produced tyranny, the American covenant invoked providence and produced liberty. The former's theology sanctified power. The latter's theology limited it. History vindicates not empire, but covenant. The republic, grounded in divine moral law rather than divine monarchy, stands as the truer reflection of the heavenly kingdom, where God alone reigns. 13. Political economy of theocracy. Insights from Winthrop. R. Winthrop and co-authors in The Political Economy of Theocracy provides a rigorous framework to understand the dangers of merging religious and political authority. Their analysis aligns precisely with the historical record of Byzantine and other imperial Christian systems, reinforcing the essay's contrast with America's covenantal model. Key insights from Winthrop's work include: 1. Concentration of authority breeds corruption. When political and religious power is unified, elites exploit divine legitimacy to justify personal gain. Byzantine emperors, claiming God's sanction, use their position to amass wealth, command military loyalty, and suppress rivals, demonstrating how power without accountability invariably leads to instability. 2. Religious legitimacy masks self-interest. Imperial rhetoric, including the Byzantine doctrine of symphonia, the supposed harmonious partnership of church and state, served primarily to consolidate elite authority, not to safeguard moral or civic order. Historical events, from palace coups to ecclesiastical purges, expose the myth of perfect coordination. In reality, the church was often a tool, not a moral arbiter. 3. Weak self-correction leads to cycles of violence. Unlike America's covenantal republic, Byzantine Christendom lacked mechanisms to correct systemic failures without resorting to bloodshed. Revolts, assassinations, and iconoclastic campaigns illustrate a polity trapped in cycles of coercion in which moral or institutional failures were features, not flaws. Applied to America, Winthrop's insights highlight the genius of the constitutional covenant. Power is divided, authority is checked. Law, conscience, and civic virtue prevent the systemic abuses endemic to imperial Christendom. Institutional self-correction via elections, judicial review, and civic participation ensures moral failures are flaws to be remedied, not structural features. In this light, America's covenantal system is not only morally superior, but empirically more stable. While Byzantium relied on coercion and Russian Orthodoxy and later perpetuated the illusion of symphonia, the American Republic demonstrates that enduring liberty and divine favor flow from covenantal obedience and not human force. 14. America's covenant as the moral witness, from Cinna to Philadelphia. From the prophets to the patriots, one truth resounds: God alone is king. America's founding codified this principle into a covenantal republic where law and conscience are subordinate to divine authority rather than human ambition. The American system embodies self-correcting liberty rooted in biblical conscience. Where imperial Christendom relied on coercion and cycles of bloodshed, America relies on conscience, civic virtue, and constitutional mechanisms to correct error. Early instances of religious tension, such as the Protestant popedom controversies in the late 19th centuries, demonstrate that the American experiment was not flawless, yet through legal and civic processes it corrected itself. Nicholas P. Miller, The Religious Roots of the First Amendment, highlights how dissenting Protestants ensured that freedom of conscience became a constitutional guarantee. transforming past religious successes into enduring liberty. This moral witness contrasts sharply with Byzantine and later imperial Christianity, and those systems' longevity or territorial expansions was mistaken for divine blessings. In reality, enduring imperial structures often conceal fatal flaws in force-based religious doctrine. Coercion replaced conscience, and power masqueraded as providence. By contrast, America's covenantal foundation ensures that divine favor manifests in moral obedience and civic virtue, not in mere survival or conquest. Furthermore, the founders' vision, rooted in Lockean Christianity, recognized the same God in their biblical conscience as they appeal to in governance. John Adams affirmed that the principles of Christianity inform public morality, while Jefferson's Creator God in the American mind represented the eternal lawgiver whose authority justified neither human monarchs nor imperial coercion. This unity of divine authority across personal faith, public conscience, and public order ensures that the Republic remains aligned with God's moral law. America's covenant, therefore, is not a mere political framework, it is a moral and spiritual testament, demonstrating that a polity grounded in biblical conscience can endure, correct its errors, and flourish without resorting to violence. The empire sought to replace God's kingship with Caesar's, the Republic sought to restore it under God. Its enduring system of liberty, rooted in covenant and conscience, stands as a definitive witness that governance under God produces justice, stability, and moral excellence. I guess that's all. Yeah, that's all 14. Should have been add more, but that should get the point across, basically. Which about ideologies and system, because I see this comparison, right? Why do you want to be like Byzantium when you've never lived there? Like some of these American converts, to Orthodox Christianity, right? Promoting monarchy and all this other craziness. I'm saying we're not even the same Christian nation. So other essays I prove how America's Christian, how from its Revolutionary War, even from before that, right? The roots of the Pilgrims and all that, the kind of religion they brought into America, and how the Republic is conceived in that biblical consciousness, how the American mind, as Jefferson talks about, that's reflecting in the Declaration of Independence, right? Which was based on the general principles of Christianity of Locke. And Locke's God is one God. Therefore, the American founders' liberalism is one God. Dissenters had one God. So the plurality in the religion of the founding, right, reflects a biblical religion and morality in light of Locke and dissenting Christians. So we're nothing like Byzantium. There's no king is needed but God. All right? Then let me see if I can find the sources or so. These are the sources I used. Had to correct it because it mistake. I think another book had a similar title, right? And it wasn't the one I was using, but this is basically the sources. And then books that I provided, several books that I read. Some of them I brought up because it has something to do with the subject, right? But overall, I read pretty much majority of these books. And if they interest you, you can pick them up yourself, I used several books because I had to keep revising it and stuff. Because the chat kept deleting stuff, removing things, right? Making weird integrations and stuff, so I had to constantly correct it and stuff. So anyway, if you like my videos, please like and subscribe. Thank you.